The message that arrived was short, almost too short for the weight it carried. A single transmission, carried across the stars, with a calm voice behind it that sounded neither threatening nor desperate. It was the kind of voice that spoke as if the future had already been decided. The words were simple. Asterisk, the Terran Union offers an agreement. Refuse it and you accept the consequences. Asterisk. No one laughed, but no one truly believed it either. That was the problem. Humanity had come late into the galactic stage, a fractured species that still bore scars from its own wars. They weren't supposed to rise so quickly, weren't supposed to leap from conflict into unity with such speed. And yet, here they were, placing proposals before powers that had stood for centuries. Old civilizations who thought themselves unshakable now found themselves staring at humans across the negotiation table. The council chamber was filled with tension that could not be seen, only felt. Banners of different empires hung heavy on the walls, their colors faded with age, their crests carved into history. They had survived wars that had burned whole systems, treaties that had broken star clusters in two, and rivalries that had lasted generations. And yet, none of those moments felt as dangerous as this one. Not because of the Terrans' numbers, those were small compared to the great empires, but because of something deeper. Something in the way humans looked at the galaxy, something in the way they never bowed their heads even when surrounded. At the heart of the council sat the envoy of the Terran Union. Calm, composed, eyes sharp as if measuring not just the words being spoken, but the very air being breathed. He did not shout, did not posture, did not threaten. Instead he explained. Quietly, firmly. Every sentence carried weight, as if humanity had thought of every outcome before stepping into the room. As if they already knew the choices others would make. The proposal was laid out simply. Mutual defense. Trade agreements. Exchange of knowledge. Support against the growing shadows on the edge of the galaxy. Unnamed threats that had swallowed fleets in silence. It was not dominance they offered but partnership. Not demands but a path forward together. And yet there was a catch. Refuse and humanity would walk away. No war declared, no immediate strike, no raised weapons. Just silence. Isolation. And in that silence the humans promised nothing. No aid, no trade, no alliance. Just the knowledge that when the storms came, and they would come, those who refused would face them alone. The council chamber erupted in whispers, layered in fear and pride. Some saw the Terran words as arrogance, others as warning. But pride is a dangerous thing. Too many rulers had built their empires on the belief that their people could never fall, that their fleets were eternal, that their history made them untouchable. To them, humanity's rise was an insult. A younger species daring to stand eye to eye with those who had shaped the stars before humans even learned fire. Behind every whisper was the same question. What happens if we refuse? That question lingered long after the envoy departed, and it grew sharper with every passing day. Reports arrived from border systems. Strange movements. Fleets disappearing. A darkness that was not human in origin was spreading, testing, consuming. But still many refused to see the connection. They told themselves humanity was exaggerating. That Terrans were only trying to gain power through fear. And so the vote was cast. Refusal. Not unanimous but enough. Enough to turn their backs on the Terran proposal. When the message was sent back, it was written in the language of pride. Words like sovereignty, independence, and dignity lined the transmission. They believed they had stood tall, unbent before a rising species. They believed the galaxy would applaud their strength. But what they received was silence. The Terrans did not argue. They did not send fleets in anger. They did not plead or threaten. They simply closed their eyes to those who had turned away, as if a door had been shut forever. The stars felt colder after that. Days passed. Then weeks. And one by one the first cracks began to show. Border patrols went missing. Colonies called for help and no answer came. The shadows at the edge of the galaxy moved closer, but this time there were no Terran fleets arriving at the last second. No warnings shared. No hand extended. The silence was heavier than war. For the first time in living memory, the mighty empires of the council felt small. Their fleets, once thought unstoppable, were torn apart by something they did not understand. And in the chaos, a question burned through every heart. Had they refused the wrong offer? What made the Terran Union different was not numbers, not weapons, not technology. It was will. A stubborn, relentless will that refused to die, that refused to accept defeat, that refused to abandon allies even when the cost was unbearable. They had offered that will freely, placed it in the hands of others. And those others had turned away. The silence grew louder. Every world lost, every fleet destroyed, echoed with the unspoken truth. This is the price of refusing the Terran proposal. And yet, within the ruins, hope flickered. Because rumors began to spread. Whispers carried on the winds of dying colonies. Stories of Terran ships appearing at the edges of doomed systems, not to conquer, not to claim, but to watch. To see who would endure, who would fight despite the odds. Humanity had not vanished completely, they were waiting. Waiting to see who would understand the meaning of their offer. Waiting for someone to learn the cost of pride. The council that once laughed in whispers now sat in silence, their voices choked with fear. Each ruler, each admiral, each diplomat began to realize that refusal was not an ending, it was only the beginning. The Terrans had not abandoned them out of weakness, but out of certainty. Certainty that the storms would come, and that only those who had chosen to stand together would survive. And then one night a second message arrived. Shorter than the first. Colder. A reminder written in only a few words. Asterisk, you chose. Now live with it. Asterisk. The chamber fell silent. No one moved. No one breathed. For the first time in centuries, the empires of the stars felt the weight of being truly alone. Outside, in the void, the darkness drew closer. The decision had already been made. The question now was not what the Terrans would do but what the others would endure. The price of refusing the Terran proposal had only just begun to be paid, and the galaxy would soon learn whether that price could be survived. The silence after that second message never truly ended. It hung over every meeting, every transmission, every private conversation whispered in the dim glow of command centers. No one wanted to admit it aloud, but the decision to refuse the Terran proposal was beginning to feel like a weight no one could carry. The empires had spoken with confidence, but confidence had given way to uncertainty, and uncertainty was bleeding into fear. On the fringes of known space, colonies that once flourished now struggled. Supply routes were broken, convoys vanished into dark stretches where signals died without warning. At first, the councils called it coincidence, blamed it on pirates or local unrest. But when whole fleets disappeared without even a distress signal, no excuses could soften the truth. Something was out there. Something vast, something merciless. And for the first time, the great powers looked into the dark and realized they had no idea what was staring back. It was then that some began to remember the tone of the Terran envoy. Calm, steady, not boastful. Almost weary, as if they had seen this before. As if humanity had already faced the kind of darkness now spreading across the stars. The Terrans had not threatened, they had warned. That difference was becoming clear now, but it was too late to undo the vote. Pride once spoken cannot easily be swallowed. In private chambers, voices cracked under pressure. Some rulers argued that humanity had exaggerated everything to gain leverage. Others argued the opposite, that Terrans had held back details, knowing the galaxy wasn't ready to hear the full truth. Both arguments circled endlessly, but neither produced answers. And the fleets kept vanishing. For the soldiers at the borders, the silence was worse than combat. Outposts received garbled signals, bursts of static, half-finished pleas for help that ended mid-word. Patrols sent to investigate returned shattered or not at all. Survivors whispered of shadows moving without form, weapons failing for reasons they couldn't explain, and an enemy that did not speak or negotiate. The fear wasn't just in the loss of ships, but in the complete lack of understanding. No one knew who or what they were facing. The Terrans, meanwhile, said nothing. Their fleets were seen only from a distance, shadows against the stars. Sometimes a Terran ship would be detected near a failing colony, watching from just outside range. They never interfered, never offered rescue. They only observed. And somehow that was worse than their absence. To be watched, silently, while worlds burned, drove paranoia through the councils. Did humanity intend to let the galaxy fall before stepping in? Were they proving a point? Or were they testing, waiting to see who would survive long enough to be worth saving? Among ordinary people, the story spread like fire. In markets and streets, families whispered the same question the rulers feared. Why didn't we accept the Terran proposal? The Terrans, once dismissed as an upstart species, began to take on a new image. Not as conquerors, but as the only ones who had seen the storm coming. Every disappearance, every broken convoy, was proof that humanity had understood something the others had ignored. And that truth cut deeper than any weapon. For the Terrans themselves, little was known. Their worlds were closed to outsiders, their transmissions rare. Yet fragments of their past had been shared long before the proposal, and those fragments painted a picture most had dismissed. A species that had nearly destroyed itself in war after war, only to rise again stronger. A people who had faced extinction from within, who had learned to unify not in peace but in desperation. They had carried that fire into the stars, tempered not by victory but by survival. And maybe that was the secret others had missed. Humanity had been forged in loss, in mistakes, in pain. Where the older empires had grown comfortable in long stretches of stability, the Terrans had been forced to rebuild again and again. Their history was a chain of disasters endured, and in enduring they had learned what others had forgotten, that strength was not in fleets or weapons, but in refusing to fall no matter how many times the world broke apart. That was what they had offered. Not resources. Not technology. A will that refused to surrender even in the face of the unknown. Now, as the shadows spread, the empires felt the weight of what they had turned away. Fleets were mobilized, defenses tightened, but every move felt too late. The enemy, if it could even be called that, moved with purpose that no one understood. They did not answer hails. They did not negotiate. They did not even leave wreckage that could be studied. They consumed and moved on, leaving silence behind them. Whispers began to rise in the council halls that refusing humanity's offer had doomed them all. Some wanted to reopen talks, to beg for what they had once dismissed. Others feared that it was already too late, that humanity's silence meant the chance was gone forever. And still the Terran ships watched from the dark. For those who had seen the envoy's eyes during the proposal, there was something haunting in the memory. It was not the look of a conqueror or a diplomat. It was the look of someone who knew what was coming and was offering one final chance before stepping aside. That look returned in dreams, in sleepless nights, when the silence of the stars pressed too heavily on the soul. Every day that passed, the cost of refusal grew heavier. Colonies lost. Fleets broken. Confidence shattered. The galaxy's strongest powers were learning that pride could not shield them from the dark. And as fear spread, one truth became unavoidable. The Terran Union had offered them a way forward, and they had chosen to walk alone. But rumors persisted. In hidden corners, travelers spoke of isolated worlds where Terran forces had intervened quietly without announcement. Places where colonies thought lost had been saved at the last moment by human fleets that appeared from nowhere, fought with a fury no words could capture, and vanished again without waiting for thanks. Were these stories real? Or were they born from desperation, people clinging to the hope that humanity still cared? No one knew. But the whispers gave just enough hope to keep the galaxy searching for an answer. Searching for a way back to the offer they had refused. In the end, the question was no longer whether the Terrans had been right. The question was how long the galaxy could survive without them. And with every passing day, the silence of the Terran Union seemed louder than war. Because silence, when wrapped around fear, is the most powerful weapon of all. And somewhere beyond the reach of the Council, humanity waited. Not to be begged, not to be praised, but to see who would finally understand the price that had been set in motion. The galaxy had chosen. Now it would live, or die, with that choice. But in the darkness, unseen, the true storm was still gathering. And what was coming would make every lost fleet, every broken colony, feel like nothing more than the first drop of rain before the flood. The stars themselves seemed restless. Entire sectors that once pulsed with trade and travel now lay empty, quiet as a graveyard. Transmission channels that used to hum with chatter carried only static. Fleets were sent into the dark with promises of swift return, but the return never came. Each loss piled onto the last, until even the most confident leaders could no longer disguise their unease. The Terrans still did not speak. Their silence had become a presence, almost heavier than the threat consuming the galaxy. Their ships lingered at the edges of battles, watching, waiting, never interfering. For those who glimpsed them through fractured scanners, it was unbearable. Help was so close, yet so far. People cursed them, begged them, whispered their names in anger and in desperate prayers. Humanity remained a shadow in the storm, withholding the one thing that everyone needed, their will to fight together. But as the shadows pressed closer, cracks began to widen within the mighty empires. Alliances that had stood for generations wavered. Some rulers demanded immediate talks with the Terran Union, even if it meant bowing lower than pride allowed. Others refused, insisting that the empires must face the darkness alone rather than admit they had been wrong. The chamber of councils filled with shouting matches that ended in silence, as none could offer real solutions. Meanwhile, ordinary people suffered. Families fled worlds that were marked as unsustainable. Refugee ships crowded border stations. Children asked questions their parents couldn't answer. Why aren't the Terrans helping us? Why won't anyone stop this? There were no answers, only fear. And with each passing week, more voices began to admit what none dared say aloud at first. the galaxy was dying. In the shadows of abandoned colonies, fragments of truth were uncovered. Survivors spoke of enemies that were not armies but something worse, hordes that moved like living storms, relentless and silent. Weapons that had once turned fleets into dust had little effect on them. They didn't conquer. They consumed. They left nothing but emptiness, as if even memory itself had been erased. And still the Terrans waited. When Terran ships did appear, their presence carried a cruel kind of comfort. Sometimes they would linger just long enough to confirm the scale of destruction before slipping back into the void. The survivors who caught sight of them would scream for help, fire flares into the sky, plead across open channels. But no reply ever came. The Terrans would vanish again, leaving only questions behind. That was when whispers turned into something sharper. Perhaps humanity was not waiting to save them at all. Perhaps the Terrans were testing them, measuring their strength, deciding who deserved survival. Perhaps this silence was the judgment written in their proposal long ago. If so, the price of refusing it was not just survival, it was being weighed, being found unworthy. The councils grew frantic. Fleets were pulled back to protect core worlds, abandoning outlying colonies. Borders shrank. Trust between empires fractured further, as each accused the other of weakness, betrayal, or secret talks with the Terrans. Some leaders swore that humanity was behind the attacks, unleashing horrors to force the galaxy into submission. Others rejected that thought, but the suspicion never truly died. Then came the night that shook everything. One of the great capitals, a world thought untouchable, was struck. Entire defense networks collapsed in hours. Vast shields flickered and died. Cities that had stood for millennia were silenced in a single night of chaos. Fleets scrambled to respond, but what they faced was beyond comprehension. The storm that fell upon that world did not come in ships with banners or fleets with names. It was something formless, endless, and merciless. And above it all, hidden in the black, Terran ships were seen. Watching. The reports that escaped that night were broken, filled with static and screams. But one phrase echoed again and again. They knew. The Terrans knew. The surviving rulers could no longer ignore the truth. Whether they wanted to admit it or not, the galaxy stood on the edge of collapse. Worlds were burning, fleets crumbling, people scattering. And humanity had offered them a lifeline, only to have it thrown back in their faces. The question that haunted every chamber now was not why did we refuse, but would the Terrans still be willing to save us? But approaching them now felt like stepping onto a battlefield unarmed. Would the Terrans listen? Would they forgive? Or would they simply turn away and let the galaxy fall, satisfied that the price had been paid? Suspense hung over every gathering, every word spoken in council halls. Envoys whispered about secret attempts to reach the Terran Union, though none could confirm if those messages had been received. Others claimed humanity had already chosen its allies quietly, rescuing those who fought hardest while letting the rest fall. The mystery deepened and with it, fear. And all the while the shadows closed in. Systems that had once been names on star charts were now only silence. Fleets, once symbols of pride, were shattered and scattered across the void. The galaxy itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the moment when either salvation or destruction would come. The Terrans had not spoken since their last message. That silence had grown into a storm of its own, heavy with tension. Would they remain in the dark forever? Or were they waiting for one final moment? The moment when the galaxy had no choice but to understand the truth of the proposal they had refused? The climax was drawing near, though no one could yet see its shape. Every ruler, every soldier, every refugee felt it in their bones. Something was about to break. The question was simple, terrifying, and unanswered. Would the Terrans extend their hand one last time, or would they finally let the galaxy learn the full cost of its pride? The answer waited in the silence of the stars, where Terran eyes still watched. And soon, very soon, that silence would shatter. Just when the galaxy thought it had begun to grasp the shape of its doom, another revelation tore through the darkness. In the ruins of a colony on the far rim, scavenger crews stumbled upon something that should not have been there. Buried beneath collapsed cities and silenced outposts, fragments of data were recovered, logs not from the colonists but from Terran vessels. They weren't just watching. They had been there before the destruction, monitoring, recording, and leaving without interference. The implications spread like wildfire. Humanity hadn't been absent. Humanity had seen the storm coming closer, step by step, and still chose not to intervene. The discovery split the galaxy into deeper chaos. Some rulers howled with rage, calling it proof of betrayal. They claimed the Terrans had set this all in motion, a manipulation to force obedience through fear. Others argued the opposite, that the Terrans were searching for something in the destruction, something they weren't ready to reveal. Perhaps the proposal had been more than an alliance. It had been a warning that no one took seriously. But the real twist came days later, when a shattered fleet limped back to a stronghold world. The survivors spoke of something even more chilling than the nameless enemy. Among the shadows they swore they saw Terran ships fighting, not against the storm but alongside it. Blackened silhouettes that carried Terran signatures moved with the same merciless precision as the formless threat. At first, the account was dismissed as hysteria from traumatized crews. Yet sensor records matched. The enemy, it seemed, carried Terran echoes in its movements. The possibility hit like a blade to the chest. Had humanity created this? Had they unleashed it long ago, some weapon gone out of control? Or worse, was this enemy a reflection of them, something born from their own history of war and survival, something they had tried to contain but could no longer control? The fear spread faster than truth. The galaxy no longer only faced annihilation from an unknown enemy, it faced the possibility that the one species it could have relied on was bound to that enemy by blood or by design. Trust shattered further. Some called for war against humanity itself, declaring that even if the storm consumed them, they would not kneel to the Terrans. Others, desperate, pleaded that this only proved how vital humanity's will was, that if anyone could stop such a threat, it was the species that had endured worse within themselves. In the middle of that storm of doubt, Terran silence deepened the wound. No denial came. No explanation. No message to confirm or deny the rumors. The Union simply watched as empires tore themselves apart, as suspicion gnawed through fragile alliances. The choice to remain silent became a weapon sharper than any fleet. And yet, for those who studied the fragments closely, another pattern emerged. The enemy did not strike blindly. Their movements had purpose. They avoided certain sectors, curved around hidden lines and left scattered outposts untouched. On every one of those spared worlds, later scans revealed faint traces of Terran presence. Not permanent but recent. As if humanity was mapping the destruction, guiding it, or redirecting it. The realization sent chills through even the strongest leaders. The storm was not random. It was being shaped. Whether by Terrans themselves or by something they had once created was unclear. But the truth was unavoidable. The galaxy was not simply under attack. It was caught in the middle of a design that no one understood. The fear reached its peak when an intercepted transmission leaked into the public. It was not long but it was undeniably Terran. A single voice, flat and steady, speaking words that were never meant to be heard beyond their ranks. Asterisk, the test is nearly complete. Only the willing will endure. Asterisk. The word spread across every world like fire. Entire populations demanded answers. What test? Who decided who was willing? Was the destruction a trial, and if so, what was humanity waiting to see? For ordinary people it was unbearable. They were no longer only running from an unknown enemy, they were trapped in something larger, a game of survival written by a species that had once asked them to join willingly. Now the question burned in every heart. Was the Terran proposal truly an offer of alliance, or had it been a chance to escape judgment? The empires began to fracture under the weight of that doubt. Some secretly sent envoys toward Terran space, desperate to beg for inclusion, even if it meant surrender. Others doubled down, vowing never to bend. Fleets were aimed not only at the storm but at each other. The galaxy was preparing to turn inward, ready to tear itself apart before the enemy even finished consuming it. And still, through it all, Terran ships appeared in the dark, silent, patient, watching. Sometimes they moved alongside the enemy as if guiding it. Sometimes they shadowed refugee convoys but never intervened. It was impossible to tell which side they were truly on. But one truth grew clearer with every passing day: the Terrans held the key. Whether as creators of the storm or as the only ones strong enough to defy it, they stood at the center of everything. The galaxy's fate was no longer in the hands of its oldest empires. It belonged to the youngest species, the one they had once dismissed, the one they had refused. And now the price of that refusal was coming due in full. The climax loomed closer, written in fire across the stars. Worlds burned, fleets shattered, and the shadows tightened their hold. Every eye turned toward the Terrans, waiting for the moment when they would finally break their silence. The question was no longer whether humanity would act. The question was whether, when they did, it would be as saviors or executioners. The galaxy reached its breaking point. Entire star systems were gone, consumed in silence. The storm pressed inward and no defense could hold. The empires had exhausted their fleets, their pride, their strength. Refugee ships filled the void between worlds, fleeing from one place only to find another already lost. Rumors of Terran betrayal hung heavy, poisoning what little hope remained. Some leaders prepared to surrender to the storm itself, believing there was no way forward. Others whispered that humanity had been right all along, that this was the cost of refusal, and the only way to survive now was to beg for Terran mercy. Then, for the first time since the proposal, the Terran spoke. The transmission came without warning. Every channel lit up across the stars, carrying the same steady voice that had once offered alliance in calm terms. There was no anger in it, no triumph, only the weight of truth. Asterisk, the test is over. You now see what we warned you of. What you face is not ours, but it is something we have endured before. It cannot be defeated by pride, nor by numbers. Only unity has ever stood against it. That was our proposal. That was your choice. And now the choice must be made again. Stand with us or be consumed. Asterisk. The words fell like thunder. For the first time the Terrans gave a name to the enemy. Not a race, not a nation, but a force older than memory, a tide that rose every few ages to devour what had grown too divided. They called it the Abyss. It did not negotiate, it did not desire, it did not stop. It fed on separation, on weakness, on arrogance. And humanity had seen it once before, in its own past, in wars so devastating that their history bore only fragments of what survived. They had rebuilt from the edge of extinction, learning the one truth the galaxy had refused to hear. Only together could life endure. The proposal had never been about trade or fleets. It had been about preparing for this moment. For a breathless span of days the galaxy wavered. Some refused even now, unwilling to kneel to a younger species. Others bent under the weight of their people's desperation, ready to do anything for survival. And in the midst of it all, the storm arrived at the heart of the galaxy. The capital of the Council, the proud world that had once mocked the Terran's warning, became the stage of the final stand. The abyss fell upon it like a tidal wave of shadows, overwhelming defenses in moments. Its skies burned. Cities crumbled. Panic spread like fire. And above it all, watching from the dark, Terran fleets emerged in numbers the galaxy had never imagined. They had not been silent because they were weak. They had been silent because they were preparing. Hundreds of ships, forged from the lessons of endless survival, descended into the battle. They did not fight as individuals but as one, moving with precision born of shared will. Their weapons struck not wildly but in unison, driving holes into the endless tide. Where other fleets had scattered, Terran forces closed ranks, each ship covering another, every pilot fighting not for themselves but for the whole. It was a living demonstration of what they had offered, the strength of unity. The battle was chaos made flesh. The abyss writhed and shifted, endless waves pressing against human steel and fire. The other empires, stunned into action, rallied their broken fleets to join. Some ships fought shoulder to shoulder with the Terrans, finally setting aside pride. Others hung back, torn by mistrust, watching even as their world burned. And that hesitation cost them. The abyss struck hardest where divisions remained. On the surface below, citizens saw Terran dropships descend into burning cities, pulling civilians from the ruins. For those who had cursed them as betrayers, the sight was like a knife in the chest. Humanity had not abandoned them. They had waited until the moment was undeniable, until the galaxy understood what unity meant. But the battle was not victory. For every abyss form destroyed, more poured forth. It became clear that no fleet could simply outfight it. The Terrans knew this, and at last they revealed the final part of their plan. At the heart of their armada, a colossal ship emerged, older than any design known, scarred by battles long past. Within it, they carried the last remnant of their own near extinction, a weapon born not to destroy the abyss, but to seal it away. It was not power that made it work, but sacrifice. It required more than firepower. It required every fleet, every empire, every survivor to lend strength, to fight not as divided nations but as one. Without that, the weapon would fail. The transmission spread across the stars once more. Asterisk, we cannot do this alone. We never could. Choose now. Stand with us or watch the galaxy fall. Asterisk. The choice was no longer political. It was survival itself. And in that moment, when all seemed lost, something shifted. Fleets that had once doubted moved to cover Terran lines. Commanders who had once mocked humanity gave orders to follow their lead. Ships from rival empires aligned fire, shields, and strategies with Terran squadrons. For the first time the galaxy fought as one. The weapon came to life. A surge of light brighter than suns poured into the void, weaving through the abyss like fire through dry grass. The tide screamed, not with sound but with the shuddering of space itself, as it was forced back, driven into the rift from which it had come. Piece by piece, the endless dark collapsed, until at last, silence returned to the stars. The abyss was sealed. The galaxy had survived. But the price was written in fire. Entire fleets lay in ruin. Worlds had been scarred beyond recognition. Millions were gone. And at the heart of it all, the Terrans revealed the truth they had never spoken aloud. The abyss would return again one day. Not tomorrow, not in a generation, but eventually. It always did. That was the cycle humanity had endured once before, the reason they had risen not in peace but in preparation. Their proposal had never been about dominance. It had been about teaching the galaxy how to survive the storm when it came again. The councils, broken and humbled, stood in silence. They had refused, and their refusal had nearly ended them all. Now, with smoke still rising from their capitals, they faced the same decision once more, to unite or to fall apart again. And then came the final twist. As the fleets gathered to honor the victory, Terran ships began to withdraw, not in triumph but in silence. When asked why, their answer was as steady as ever. We have done our part. The galaxy must choose its own path now. Unity cannot be given. It must be chosen. But long-range scans revealed something chilling. Not all of the abyss had been sealed. A fragment had broken away, slipping into the dark before the rift closed. Small but alive. And it carried with it something new, Terran technology woven into its form. The weapon had worked, but it had also changed the enemy. The war was over, but the seed of the next one had already been planted. And the galaxy realized with dread that the price of refusing the Terran proposal had been only the beginning. The silence after the battle was heavy, like the galaxy itself was holding its breath. The shattered remains of ships still drifted through the void, their twisted hulls reflecting the light of distant suns. Humanity had endured, but the cost was written in scars across every surviving face, in the empty seats where friends and family should have been. For a moment no one spoke. They were waiting to see if the universe had truly quieted or if another storm would come. The Terran fleet had pulled itself together in the aftermath, battered but not broken. There was exhaustion in every movement of the crews, but also a strange, unshakable strength. Against impossible odds, they had forced the galaxy to face a truth it had tried to deny. Humanity would not bow, not be dismissed, not be erased. They had stood, and in standing they had changed everything. On the surface of the neutral station where the final decisions would be made, the surviving human representatives gathered with the alien delegations. The hall still bore the marks of conflict, a reminder of what had nearly been lost. The air was tense, filled with the weight of unspoken words. Many of the alien envoys could not meet human eyes, ashamed of their part in rejecting the proposal that had once been offered so openly, so peacefully. That refusal had brought them all to the edge of annihilation. One of the elders of the council finally stood, his voice rough, carrying the fatigue of his species near extinction. He admitted what so many had been unwilling to say. They had underestimated humanity. They had mistaken patience for weakness, generosity for naivety, and the desire for peace as a lack of resolve. But humanity had shown them the truth in fire and sacrifice. Their proposal had not been a plea. It had been a gift. And it was the galaxy's arrogance that had turned that gift into war. The words struck deep, and in the silence that followed, the humans stood together, scarred soldiers, weary diplomats, grieving survivors. They did not gloat. They did not sneer or remind the others of their failure. They simply waited, letting the silence do its work. Humanity's greatest strength was not only in its will to fight but in its ability to endure, to rise again even when crushed to the brink. That quiet strength was more powerful than any weapon. When the new terms were finally laid upon the table, the choice was no longer forced. The galaxy understood now. It was not about domination. It was about survival together, about trust, about the fragile but powerful bond of shared futures. This time there was no refusal. The Terran proposal was accepted, not out of fear alone, but out of respect earned in the harshest crucible imaginable. But even in that moment of resolution, a final twist emerged. The humans revealed what they had hidden through the war. Their fleets, their armies, their desperate fight had never been their full strength. Much had been held back not as a threat but as a choice. Humanity had never sought to annihilate its rivals. They had chosen to fight only to the level needed to survive, never unleashing their darkest weapons, never resorting to their most terrible innovations. The galaxy had nearly destroyed itself against only a fraction of what humanity could wield. This revelation did not come as a boast. It came as a warning wrapped in kindness. Humanity did not want to rule the stars through fear. They wanted the others to understand that peace was not weakness, that unity was not surrender. The restraint they had shown was the clearest proof of their true nature. And it was that restraint, more than any battle won, that convinced the galaxy of the price of refusal. As the agreements were sealed, there was no cheering, no celebration. Too many lives had been lost for that. But there was a quiet sense of something new beginning, a fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, this time the galaxy would listen. Later, alone in the viewing chamber overlooking the stars, one of the human leaders stood in silence. The stars stretched out forever, brilliant and cold, and for a moment they thought of the ones who had fallen. Voices never to be heard again, faces burned into memory. Every victory felt smaller against the weight of those losses. And yet, those sacrifices meant something. They had carved a path forward that no one could ignore. The price of refusing had been high. Too high. But in paying it, the galaxy had finally understood what kind of people the Terrans were. Not monsters. Not conquerors. Survivors. Builders. Dreamers. A species that would not let itself be erased, no matter how great the odds against it. In the years that followed, alliances grew where there had once been rivalries. The scars of war did not fade quickly, but they became reminders, warnings of what pride and mistrust could cost. And through it all, humanity's voice grew stronger, not because of dominance, but because they had shown the truth of themselves in the hardest way possible. When children of both human and alien blood one day asked their elders what had changed, the answer was always the same. They spoke of a proposal once rejected, of a war that should never have been fought, and of the moment the galaxy realized what it meant to stand against Terrans. They spoke of the price of refusal, and how no one would ever dare pay it again. As the story of that time spread, it did not become a tale of conquest, but one of endurance, of pain turned into resolve, of fire that forged something stronger than steel. And somewhere, among the stars, the memory of those who had given everything lingered like a quiet promise, that humanity would always rise, not to crush but to endure, to dream, and to lead the way forward when others faltered. The war had ended, but the legacy of it lived on, a reminder etched across the cosmos that the Terran spirit could not be refused. And though the stars stretched endlessly into darkness, humanity carried with them a light born of sacrifice and unity, a light that could not be dimmed. That was the true price of refusing the Terran proposal. And it was a price no one would ever risk paying again.